Okay, we're now going to begin discussing quadratic equations. In this section, we're going to divide this into two videos, but mainly we're looking at solving quadratic equations. We'll talk more about graphing and other things later on in the course. So we're going to focus on two methods in this video. We'll have a second video that focuses on the other, and this is solving equations by factoring, and then also solving equations by completing the square. Now, solving equations by factoring is relatively straightforward. But before we do that, let's talk about quadratic equations, so we make sure that we only apply these techniques to the right equation. So the general form that we're going to want to have these in is where we have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And here, a, b, and c are real numbers, and a does not equal 0. Because if a equaled 0, we wouldn't have quadratic anymore, because it's the x squared that makes it a quadratic. Alright, so let's look at an example here of solving these by factoring. This first one hopefully is pretty straightforward. We've done plenty of factoring up to this point, hopefully. X squared minus 2x minus 8 equals 0. So to solve this, as I said, we simply factor this, and if we look at this for a little bit, this factors pretty easily. This is going to factor to x minus 4, and then x plus 2. And then we will go ahead and use the zero product property, and basically the zero product property is saying if you have two things multiplying to 0, one of them has to be 0. In other words, we have to have x minus 4 equals 0, or x plus 2 equals 0. And then simply solving both of these, we would get that x equals 4 or x equals negative 2. So real quick, as I said, beginning example here. Let's look at another one here with factoring. So this would be x squared plus 4x is equal to 12. Now we're supposed to solve this one by factoring. Now, the first thing is we should notice here is that we need to have this in standard form to factor. I basically want to have this set equal to 0 in order to factor this. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to rewrite this as x squared plus 4x minus 12 equals 0. Then we'll go ahead and do our normal factoring on this. And again, this one's pretty straightforward to factor. You might have to sit and think about it for a second, but this factors to x plus 6 times x minus 2 equals 0. And just like above here, because I've got two things multiplying to 0, I can use what's called the zero product property, and we get that x plus 6 has to equal 0, or x minus 2 has to equal 0. So that means x is equal to negative 6, or x is equal to 2. So those would be our answers. So factoring, pretty straightforward. The only thing that can make these problems slightly more challenging is having ones that are slightly more difficult to factor. Now, let's talk about completing the square. So completing the square, well, let's first talk about the forms that we're going to look at. We're going to first want to look at it with x squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Now, you might notice that instead of having ax squared, I have just an x squared, which means there's a 1. What happens if your problem starts with a 3x squared? Well, it's easy. You just divide everything by 3, and then instead of having 3x squared, you would have just x squared. Now, the goal here is going to be using one of our special products here, and what we're going to look at here, just to illustrate what the special product or special factoring is, I'm going to go ahead and write it in different terms here. If we have s squared plus 2st plus t squared, this factors to the quantity s plus t squared. And in other words, it's a perfect square for that particular trinomial. So we're going to want to do the same thing here, but what we're going to do instead is with these x squared and bx's, you'll have the x squared plus bx, and then what we're going to want to have is plus b over 2 quantity squared is equal to x plus b over 2 quantity squared. So the important thing we're going to be using here with completing the square is this term b over 2 quantity squared. So let's look at an example here of completing the square. And so let's start with here x squared plus 2x minus 6 equals 0. Now, you could sit here for a long time and try and factor this, and you would spin your wheels. Now, some of you might say, well, we could use quadratic formula, which that's what we'll talk about in the next section, or the next video, I should say. But we're going to look at completing the square here. Now, what I like to do is move the c to the other side. So I'm left with just x squared plus bx on one side. So I have x squared plus 2x is equal to 6. Then I'm going to compute what this b over 2 is. b over 2 quantity squared. Well, this would simply be 2 over 2 squared, which of course is 1 squared, which is just 1. Now I need to have that plus b over 2 squared. Well, I'm simply going to add it to the left-hand side. So what I'm going to have here is x squared plus 2x plus 1, and then this is going to equal, well, 6, but since I added 1 to the left-hand side, properties of equation says I need to do the exact same thing to the right-hand side, so I'm also going to have a plus 1 over here. Now, how does that help us? Well, the left-hand side now factors to x plus 1 quantity squared, and the right-hand side is, of course, equal to 7. All right, now we can take the square root of both sides, and so if you take the square root of both sides, the square root of a square is going to just get rid of that square, so the left-hand side would just be x plus 1, and then you'd have, now a key thing here, when you take a square root of both sides, you get plus or minus, so I'd have plus or minus the square root of 7. And then to solve this, we're solving for x, so I subtract 1 from both sides, and I'd wind up with negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 7. And so we do get two solutions. And the two solutions we get are x equals negative 1 plus the square root of 7, and then x is equal to negative 1 minus the square root of 7. Let's look at one more example of this, maybe one that's a little bit more challenging with complete the square. So this here is 2x squared plus 8x plus 3 equals 0. Now, we have this 2 in front here, and remember we really want it to be just x squared. But as I said, what we can do is we can just divide everything by 2. So I'm going to divide the entire left-hand side by 2, and then the right-hand side by 2. Because if you do one thing on the left-hand side, you have to do it on the right-hand side. So I'll split it apart here to show this. I mean, you can skip this step that I'm doing right now, but you would end up with 2x squared over 2 plus 8x over 2 plus 3 over 2 is equal to 0 over 2. And then just go ahead and do all those divisions. 2 divided by 2 is, of course, 1. So you get x squared plus 8 divided by 2 is 4x. And then you'd have plus 3/2, and this is equal to 0. Now at this point, it's going to be solved the exact same way as we did the previous example. So I'll move that c term to the other side. So I have x squared plus 4x equals negative 3/2. Okay, then I'm going to look at what b over 2 quantity squared is. So this would be 4 over 2 squared, which is of course just 2 squared, which is 4. And then what do we have here? We have x squared plus 4x plus 4 equals negative 3/2, but remember, since I added 4 to the left-hand side, I also have to add 4 to the right-hand side. And so what do we end up getting here? Well, the left-hand side factors now, and it's going to factor to x plus 2, quantity squared. And then the right-hand side, well, negative 3/2 plus 4, just adding that together, you would get 5/2. And then, kind of proceeding the same way, we'd have x plus 2 is then going to be equal to plus or minus the square root of 5 over 2. Now, what we're going to do before we finish solving this, we're going to go ahead and rationalize my denominator. So I'd have plus or minus square root of 5 over square root of 2. So to rationalize the denominator, I would multiply the numerator by square root of 2 and the denominator by square root of 2. And so I would have x plus 2 is equal to plus or minus, well, square root of 5 times square root of 2 would be square root of 10 divided by 2. And then we have one thing left to do, which is subtract 2 from both sides. And then x would be equal to negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 10 over 2. And that would be my final answer. Now, in the next video on these quadratic equations, we will talk about the quadratic formula, and we'll also talk about something called the discriminant.